is talk about three things. First, how is the U.S. economy performing, and how is the freight economy performing in regard to what we've just been through? Second is, how do we best harmonize growth of the ports with the general economy and the communities also in which we serve? And then third, specific policy recommendations that would enable our nation to continue to grow and to continue to compete globally, and I'm going to talk quite about that. So let's start with, raise your hand if you were in your job in 2006. Okay, so a lot of people were here. Does everybody remember what the supply chain felt like at that time? Remember the creaking hearing you were hearing, the creaking noise you were hearing? That creaking noise was shortage of trucks, railroads were struggling, ports were full. Everybody remember that? So what happened? Well, the greatest recession since the Great Depression, and it made us all feel like we got a lot more capacity. So here's some numbers. 2007, these are just total TEUs coming in and out of this country. 2007, 25 million. That was the peak. The trough was 2009, 19 million. So we lost 6 million TEUs. Last year, we ended up at 22 million. We grew at 15% over the year before. We're going to get back to the peak in this country in terms of TEUs by the year 2012. If you look at North American rail units, we had a high of 775,000. We got down to 560,000. We got back to about 680 last year. We won't get back till about 2013 now. But the point is that we will be back, right? And while this thing's growing very slowly, we know that we will be back to those peak volumes. And so the question is, when we get back to the peak, will the same issues reappear that you all felt? Drayage issues, truck driver shortages, rail car issues, all those various things. So what I'd like to do is kind of unpack the 2006-2007 time period and look at what caused it and why we found ourselves in that situation. And, you know, I always kind of try and look back in terms of decades, and when we do that, we clearly see that population growth was at the center of what drove our supply chains to feel like we had inverted the balance of demand and supply. If you look back just over 4 decades, 40 years, our U.S. population grew from 200 million people to 309 million people. And if there's one thing that we do pretty well in this country, it's forecasting population growth. And the forecast in the next 40 years is to grow to 420 million people. So we're going to add another 110 or so million people. To equate that to trade, what you all do, consider this: the average American requires the freight system, total freight system, to move about 40 tons of freight per person annually. Just think about that number. Okay, now how you get there is if you buy a house, you know, they spread it over 20 years. You buy a car, you know, all this stuff. You go to the Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, Sears. I'm going to try not to forget any of my customers, but you got the plot, right? All right, so what's happened is, of course, our infrastructure is filled up with autos, trucks, trains, driven essentially by this population growth. And quite frankly, we're not keeping up with it. And we have another real challenge, and I'll talk about that, how the supply chain has changed within it. So if you go back to when the interstate highway system was built, the 1950s, completed in the 1960s, and you look at how many lane miles have been added since then, we've added 7% more new lane miles to that interstate highway system. And yet we've added 97% more VMTs, vehicles miles traveled. Well, how is that? Well, that's, again, the 200 million people to 310 million people. Average family has 2.1 cars. I don't know how we had the 0.1, but that's what it is. So we just drive a lot more, and we've filled up all these highways. I got the pleasure to drive on Seattle's highways this morning, and I mean, it was unbelievable. Rail miles, listen to this one. This one's even more telling. Rail miles are actually down a third since 1980 in this country. We've had one-third fewer rail miles in this country today than we had in 1980. So if you go out and just right here in the state of Washington, you look at the old Milwaukee Road, you can go out and you see these right-of-ways. A lot of them are bike paths now, right? And you drive along the railroad and you see these things that look like an old rail right-of-way. That's what they used to be. We've lost a third of the rail miles in this country, and yet we're now handling 60% more gross ton miles. Third smaller railroad, 60% more gross ton miles. So we really are exercising these supply chains quite dramatically. And the next 20 years, the forecasters again are expecting a 150% increase in VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, and a 90% increase in freight. And you just think about, how is this all going to work? I mean, just my drive this morning around Seattle and went down to the docks, and it's quite amazing. So what happened? How did we get to the point where clearly the world's greatest infrastructure, and it is creaking, but it's still the world's greatest infrastructure, got to this point where we're worried about the future of what's happened? Well, if you go back and think about how these infrastructures were developed, you know, we have to, as a railroad industry, we go back to the mid-1800s when these pioneers called railroad builders came out and built railroads, and it was quite amazing. You know, our railroad here, we go north out of Seattle, we go to Everett, and we take a right-hand turn going eastbound over the Cascades, and you know, these guys are out there on horseback and mules and no GPS, no helicopters, and that's what they did. In the 50s, again, it was the interstate highway system that was built out. In the 60s and the 70s, it was the investments in the commercial airports and the ports. That's where all the money was going. In the 80s, the U.S. Congress deregulated. I was talking this morning with someone, we were talking about President Carter, you know, is the guy who deregulated the airline business, the trucking industry, and the railroad business in 1980-81. So significant piece of legislation. But there's one thing in common, and that is that there's been no major investment focus in this country for at least 30 years, and arguably you could say for 50 years. So what's happened with the U.S. and how we performed? Well, it's really this infrastructure that was built by our parents and our grandparents has performed very, very, very well. It's been incredibly important to us, and everybody in this room is really responsible for developing that. If you look at just the last 40 years, U.S. trade has grown at 2x. Now think about this. U.S. trade has grown in 40 years, 40-year CAGR. It's grown at 2x of what the U.S. annual economy as a percent of GDP has grown. I mean, it's just an amazing stat for so long for it to grow double of what the U.S. economy has gone. We talk a lot about our supply chain costs as a percent of our U.S. economy, and I always put it in terms of this gives our U.S. worker headroom to be more competitive around the world, to be able to build things here and ship them all around the world. Our total supply chain costs as a percent of our GDP is about 8%, which is really, it is world class. We're still seeing in China high double-digit teens, 16, 18, 20%. Now they're going to catch up because anybody that's gone over there, what do you see? You see these massive infrastructure build-outs. What we were doing again in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they're doing, and they're going to get those costs out of their system, and they're going to be more competitive, not less with that. Well, we certainly see it firsthand on the railroad. You know, the old railroad that we all grew up loving was this, what I call a domestic railroad. We used to take finished goods, or we'd take raw materials into a plant site, and we'd haul finished goods out of that plant site. The modern railroad today is a piece of a very, very dynamic supply chain where we're moving commodities from the U.S. for export, and then we're participating in the return trip in terms of a finished product. Just for an example, 1 out of every 3 movements on our railroad today has something to do with international trade. 1 out of 3 movements. We move about 10 million units a year. 1 out of 3. It's quite amazing. So everybody in this room needs to be an advocate for the transportation supply chain and how the capacity by expanding it creates a more viable U.S. worker and a more competition.